May 8, 1945. Winston Churchill stood on a balcony overlooking Whitehall, waving to a crowd of hundreds of thousands celebrating victory in Europe. The war against Hitler was over. Britain had survived. Churchill smiled for the cameras. He flashed his famous V for victory sign. He gave speeches praising the Allied triumph and the unity of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. But Churchill was lying. Not about the victory, about the unity. Because just days earlier, Churchill had given his military chiefs an order so explosive that it would remain classified for the next 50 years. He told them to plan an attack on the Soviet Union, not a defensive contingency, not a theoretical exercise. A full-scale military offensive to begin on July 1st, 1945, less than 8 weeks away. The target was the Red Army, the same force that had just helped destroy Nazi Germany. The operation had a code name that Churchill himself may have chosen. Operation Unthinkable. And for half a century, the British government denied it ever existed. Churchill's distrust of Stalin wasn't new. It went back to the beginning of the alliance itself. In November 1943, Churchill traveled to Tehran for his first meeting with both Roosevelt and Stalin together. He expected the conference to cement the Western alliance against Soviet expansion. Instead, he watched in horror as Franklin Roosevelt publicly sided with Stalin against him. Roosevelt mocked Churchill at dinner to make Stalin laugh. He dismissed British concerns about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. Churchill returned from Tehran deeply shaken. He told his doctor, Lord Morn, that Roosevelt had no idea what he was dealing with. Stalin wasn't an ally. Stalin was a predator, waiting for the right moment to devour everything he could reach. But Roosevelt wouldn't listen. He told Churchill directly that he could handle Stalin. He said Stalin wasn't interested in expansion, just security for the Soviet Union. Churchill knew this was dangerously naive. He had been warning about totalitarian threats since the 1930s, when he stood nearly alone against appeasement of Hitler. Now he saw the same pattern repeating with Stalin. February 1945. The Big Three met again at Yalta, in the Soviet Crimea. Roosevelt was visibly dying. He had weeks to live, though few knew it at the time. Churchill watched as Roosevelt gave Stalin everything he wanted. Poland would have free elections, Stalin promised. But Poland's government would be friendly to the Soviet Union. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Churchill tried to fight for Poland. Britain had gone to war in 1939 specifically to defend Polish independence. 200,000 Polish troops had fought alongside the British throughout the war. Roosevelt sided with Stalin. Again. Churchill later wrote that he left Yalta knowing that Eastern Europe was lost. He had been overruled by an American president who trusted Stalin more than his own British ally. The Yalta agreements gave Stalin effective control over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Red Army was already occupying these countries. Stalin had no intention of leaving. Churchill returned to London and immediately began preparing for what he believed was inevitable: a confrontation with the Soviet Union. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. Harry Truman became president. Churchill saw an opportunity. Truman was inexperienced, but he didn't share Roosevelt's naive trust in Stalin. Perhaps the Americans could be convinced to take a harder line. But Churchill wasn't willing to wait for American policy to change. In early May, he summoned his military chiefs and gave them an extraordinary order. Plan an offensive against the Soviet Union. Objective: push the Red Army back and force Stalin to honor his agreements about Poland and Eastern Europe. Target date: July 1st, 1945. The British Joint Planning Staff was stunned. The war against Germany wasn't even over yet. Berlin hadn't fallen, but Churchill wanted them planning the next war before the current one finished. The planners were professionals. They didn't question whether the order was wise. They simply began calculating what it would take to attack the largest army on Earth. The planning staff faced an immediate problem. The numbers didn't work. By May 1945, the Soviet Union had roughly 7 million men under arms in the Western theater. The Red Army had 170 divisions in Europe compared to the Allies' 47. They had more tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft than the Western Allies combined. Britain and America had approximately 4 million troops in Europe. They were exhausted after years of fighting. Many American units were already being redeployed to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. The planners calculated that the Soviets outnumbered Western forces in Europe by roughly 2.5 to 1. In tanks and aircraft, the disparity was even worse. Churchill's military chiefs told him the obvious truth. A conventional attack on the Soviet Union would fail. The Red Army would absorb the initial blow and then counterattack with overwhelming force. Churchill had anticipated this problem. He had a solution that shocked even his own generals. Churchill proposed using German soldiers, not just a few advisors or specialists. Churchill wanted to rearm 100,000 Wehrmacht troops who had just surrendered to the Western Allies. German soldiers who had been fighting Britain for 6 years would be given their weapons back and sent to fight the Soviets. The planning staff was appalled. These were the same Germans who had bombed London, killed British soldiers across North Africa and Europe, and committed atrocities throughout the war. British families were still burying their dead, and Churchill wanted to arm the enemy and march alongside them. Churchill was unmoved. He argued that German soldiers knew how to fight the Russians. They had been doing it for 4 years. They understood Soviet tactics, Soviet weaknesses, Soviet vulnerabilities. More importantly, they were available. There were over 2 million German prisoners of war in Western Allied hands. Even 100,000 would significantly improve the force ratio for an attack. The planning staff noted Churchill's proposal, but made clear their doubts about German reliability and morale. They also noted the political impossibility of explaining to the British public why their sons would be fighting alongside yesterday's enemies. Churchill's plan had another fatal flaw. It required American participation. Britain alone couldn't defeat the Soviet Union. But Churchill hadn't consulted President Truman or General Eisenhower. He couldn't. If the Americans refused, the plan was dead. If word leaked to Stalin, the consequences would be catastrophic. Churchill was essentially planning to drag America into a Third World War without asking permission. The planners assessed American participation as doubtful. There was also the Pacific War. America was still fighting Japan. Truman's focus was ending that war, not starting a new one in Europe. By late May 1945, the Joint Planning Staff completed their assessment of Operation Unthinkable. Their conclusion was devastating. The operation was hazardous. In military planning language, this was as close as professional officers came to saying suicidal. The planners laid out the problems. Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming. Soviet morale was high after their victories. Soviet industry was producing weapons at a rate the West couldn't match. An initial Western offensive might gain some ground, but the Soviets would retreat, absorb the blow, and counterattack with their massive reserves. Within weeks, the Red Army would be advancing westward. The planners estimated that if the attack failed, Soviet forces could reach the English Channel. Britain itself could be invaded. The assessment was clear. Operation Unthinkable would likely fail, and failure meant Soviet domination of all Europe, not just the East. Churchill read the assessment. He didn't argue with it. Instead, he ordered a second version focused on defending Western Europe against a Soviet attack. Then he filed both versions with the highest classification and waited to see what Stalin would do. In July 1945, the British people voted. Churchill, the war hero, the man who had saved Britain from Hitler, lost in a landslide. Clement Attlee and the Labour Party won 393 seats to the Conservatives' 197. The man who had ordered Operation Unthinkable was no longer in power. Churchill handed power to Attlee on July 26, 1945. Operation Unthinkable went with him into the classified files, unknown to the new government, unknown to the public. Attlee had no interest in military confrontation with the Soviets. The plans sat in sealed folders, waiting. Operation Unthinkable remained classified for over 5 decades. The British government denied its existence whenever questions arose. Historians suspected something. Churchill's rhetoric in 1945 and 1946 was increasingly hostile to the Soviet Union. His famous Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 warned that Soviet domination of Eastern Europe was permanent and dangerous. But the idea that Churchill had actually planned to attack Stalin seemed too extreme. Most historians dismissed it as speculation. Then in 1998, the British Public Record Office declassified the documents. Operation Unthinkable was real. Churchill had ordered an attack on the Soviet Union for July 1, 1945. He had proposed rearming 100,000 German soldiers. He had been willing to risk World War III to prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Every detail that seemed too extreme to believe was confirmed in the official files. The question that Operation Unthinkable raises is uncomfortable. Was Churchill right? The plan was militarily reckless. The Joint Planning Staff correctly assessed that it would probably fail. An attack on the Soviet Union in July 1945 would likely have resulted in Soviet armies reaching the Atlantic. But Churchill's underlying analysis was correct. Stalin had no intention of honoring his agreements. Eastern Europe was going to fall under communist dictatorship. The Western democracies were going to do nothing to stop it. Churchill saw this clearly while Roosevelt was still promising that Stalin could be trusted. Churchill understood that the wartime alliance would collapse the moment the war ended. The Iron Curtain descended exactly as Churchill predicted. Millions of people in Eastern Europe spent the next 4 decades under Soviet domination. The Cold War lasted until 1991. Operation Unthinkable was impossible. But Churchill was right about why it felt necessary. Operation Unthinkable reveals something important about Churchill and about leadership in crisis. Churchill was willing to consider options that others dismissed as impossible. He asked his military chiefs to plan for something that seemed insane because he believed the alternative was worse. He was wrong about the military feasibility, but he was right about the strategic problem. The Soviet Union was an enemy pretending to be an ally. The post-war world would be shaped by that reality. Churchill's greatest strength was his willingness to see threats that others denied. He had done it with Hitler in the 1930s when almost everyone else wanted to believe that peace was possible. He did it again with Stalin in 1945. The difference was that in 1939, Britain had options. In 1945, it didn't. The military balance made confrontation impossible. Churchill had to accept an outcome he hated because the alternative was even worse. Operation Unthinkable failed. The Cold War happened instead. But for a few weeks in the spring of 1945, Winston Churchill tried to prevent it with a plan so audacious that his own government hid it for 50 years. That's the story they kept classified until 1998. The operation they called Unthinkable, and the Prime Minister who was willing to think it anyway.